Okay.
All right.
She texted me out and asked her what ribbon there was, and she said your old ribbon, and I was like, that's the wrong one, because I didn't know what ribbon was.
Yeah. I put the room number in the announcement
Well,
today.
she's supposed to be coming, she came from another meeting.
Great. Well, yeah, we were all at the Hope Lecture just now. So,
All right, guys, we're super excited to have you guys here for this debate. My name is Dan Huff. I'm the current outreach chair for the Turning Point USA chapter here at Clemson University, and I'll be one of two of your moderators tonight.
And I'm Maddie. I'm the Clemson College Democrats outreach chair. I'll also be a moderator tonight and debating tonight. And
hello, I'm Ben McCord. Thank you all for having me here from my very tiny campus. I am here representing Progressive Victory. If you don't know them, Google us, please. We need more eyes on us. I need more South Carolina soldiers. And I'm also the president of the USCA College Democrats chapter. Although I'm not representing them, my views are my own. I want to clarify that.
And ladies and gentlemen, my name is Jack Lyle. I'm the chairman of the Clemson College Republicans. Most of you guys know me, so I'll face over here. I am representing CCR this evening. All of my views are my own, but they also are representative of CCR. And I think we can introduce our topic now, yeah?
Yeah.
Okay.
So the topic tonight is whether the Trump administration is fascist. Some quick rules to go over, right? No off topic, we just want a really good flowing conversation. So also try to limit the interruptions and just keep it civil, no cursing, right? No personal insults. We'll be here to interject if anything gets too dicey, but I don't expect that. And who wants to start?
I think I should. I'm the one making the positive claim, so I have a lot of notes because the burden of proof is on me. Makes sense I go first. I'm going to start off with a pretty interesting claim, given what I'm arguing. I don't think Trump himself is actually ideologically fascist. I don't think he believes enough to appropriately be labeled as such. However, I think his administration in its behavior and in its intentions, it is fair to characterize as fascist. I don't think it is in action yet, largely thanks to the strength of the U.S. judicial system, but that strength is rapidly waning, which is why I care so much about drawing attention to this topic. Any legal system, no matter how strong, is a lot like a castle. It can be under siege for quite some time, no matter how strong the walls are. If repairs aren't made when damage is done, they will gradually erode and they will fall. And a lot of damage is being done right now. I don't think it's a coincidence that the Republican Party invited Viktor Orban to be their keynote speaker at the 2022 CPAC. The dictator of Hungary, the Varieties of Democracy Institute, and European Parliament have both declared Hungary an electoral autocracy. Dictator might be a little hyperbolic, but effectively that means they have elections, they aren't real elections. When he first came to power, this wasn't the case. This is a leader who came to power and eroded democratic institutions and then made himself an autocratic leader. This is who Republicans invited to be their keynote speaker. This is someone they have constantly referenced positively. I don't think that's a coincidence, and I think it's really bad. Now, I'm mostly going to be using Umberto Eco's 14 Points of Fascism to argue my point. I think it's going to be really important to remember that fascism is not a black and white thing. There's not a crisp line at which stepping your toe over makes you a fascist. There are degrees of fit. There are multiple characteristics of fascists that we see. The more we see these characteristics exhibited, the more fascistic a regime is.
So my name's Jack Lyle, you know that already. I'll be making the negative claim, basically defending not only the Trump administration, but also those within it. Any number of times we've heard the claim from the left over the last 12 years that the right generally is fascist now because we care about issues like not necessarily race, but identity. What is an American is essentially a question that has come into the American zeitgeist. You have all these various issues that the left claims are fascist. In fact, reading Umberto, he claims that any one of these 14 various points can be expressed by any administration or any given regime, and therefore or thereby that regime can be clarified or qualified as fascistic in some manner, which ultimately I disagree with. And so once again, as we move forward, I'll be essentially just trying to make clear that I don't see the present administration in the United States as fascistic in any number of ways, but at the same time, much less popularly, as we go through these various 14 points, I'll actually be arguing their qualifications, right? We use this term fascist as pretty much an umbrella term for anything that is seen as wrong or otherwise bad by any number of people. And generally, if you actually understand its context, then yeah, there were a lot of bad people who did things that were bad and called themselves fascist. But since then, this term has been degraded and sort of made so muddy that now it's no longer a crisp term. There's no such thing as a fascist. There's just fascism. So I'm going to be arguing that necessarily a lot of the things that Umberto Eco qualifies as fascist aren't even necessarily bad in a lot of ways. So I'll turn it back over.
Very well. Now, we do have an hour and a half for this debate, so we're on a time constraint. 14 points is a lot, and there's a lot to get into with each point.
Yep.
So I have selected the 9 most important, the 9 that I think are most detrimental to the society. We are going to go over these first, and if we have time afterwards, we're going to revisit the less important ones. I did
Can I ask
not.
you a clarifying question real quick?
Yeah.
Since I know the first point, I'll try and introduce the best I can. The first point that we'll be talking about is the rejection of the Enlightenment. And so the question that I want to ask is necessarily, is the rejection of Enlightenment bad for any society, or is it bad for specifically societies like the United States, which are structured upon the Enlightenment, essentially?
I would love to answer that.
Yeah.
I am going to just clarify something to the audience in case someone has a question. The 9 I'm choosing are not the ones I think just best fit the Trump administration. This is not done for ease of me making the argument. This is done because these are the most important and harmful. For example, point number 8, enemies being both too strong and weak simultaneously. That is, I think, arguably the easiest to say the Trump administration does constantly. That's not one of my 9. And again, I may be wrong on that. We're probably not going to have time to get into it, but I'm not choosing the easiest 9, I'm choosing the most important 9. With that, the first one I'm choosing is the second point, yes, rejection of modernism, aka the Enlightenment. I think it's pretty harmful. I think at the very least there are core ideas within the Enlightenment that we should pretty much always hold on to. Primarily those are the ones that actually I think the Trump administration is most in opposition to. Those being skepticism, pluralism, and scientific inquiry or rationalism. I think the Trump administration is pretty clearly opposed to all of those things. Pluralism being the most important because that is division of powers, and when pluralism erodes, you get autocracies.
Sure. So yeah, I think in the contemporary context, I'm actually very much in agreement with the removal of pluralism in the contemporary American political standing. I think the Democratic Party has proven itself especially over the last 6 months, to be entirely incapable of not only wielding power responsibly, but then wielding power effectively. The Biden administration was, for all intents and purposes, absolutely destructive to the United States, whether it's the economy, the society, or any number of underlying structures that really do matter as much, if not more so, than these very vague and ultimately meaningful, but at the same time less impactful concepts that we're talking about. If you can't maintain an economy over the course of 4 years, and you get voted out by an 80 electoral vote margin as a result, I mean, how am I supposed to then turn around and believe that somehow the alternative to your failure is actually worse than your failure? That's ultimately the choice that I think the majority of Americans are faced with. Either you have maybe orange man bad, or you have a guy who's going to run the economy into the ground, and can't really hold, a speech together, can't finish a sentence. Maybe he's got some kind of dementia or something like that. I think when you face Americans with those 2 choices for Kamala Harris, they're going to choose Trump every time.
I don't think that really ties into a rejection of pluralism, but I'm going to entertain some of the things expressed there anyways. Saying pluralism isn't terribly important, I think that's a little wild, given that is like one of the most fundamental aspects of resisting tyranny, is having separate power within a society. It's also foundational to the U.S. Constitution.
Sure.
It's incredibly anti-American and anti-freedom to say you're against pluralism. Pluralism is what provides us checks and balances. It's how we prevent autocracies.
In the contemporary context, I disagree, because again, the Democratic Party has shown itself to be, when you ask Democrats, are they okay with using violence to achieve their political ends, they say yes at a 35% of the time rate. And again, I don't have that in front of me, you know, I think everyone's
I'm
pretty much
familiar with
familiar
this
with that. as a
Can I
result of the
actually
Charlie
comment on
Kirk
that?
situation.
Because there's an interesting caveat for that one.
Sure.
Everyone thinks political violence is okay to achieve certain political ends. The founding fathers did. You ask those same, 10% of Republicans said they think it's okay to? You ask those same group of Republicans, do you think that the founding fathers were justified in rebelling against the British monarchy? They're going to say yes, even though that was political violence. So what that test really tells me is that Republicans don't think critically enough whenever they're answering on a concept like that.
Sure.
Because there are instances where they accept that, but they just don't realize it because it feels emotionally uncomfortable
And
to
I'll
say.
push back against that and saying the reason that Republicans ultimately reject, in the contemporary context, the concept of pluralism, while at the same time condemning political violence, is because we do have faith in the institutions, as long as they're not in the hands of people who will assassinate political commentators. You know?
I was unaware anyone who's assassinated a political commentator has control of the U.S. institution.
Well, clearly what I've done is make essentially a connection between the party who elects people like Jay Jones in Virginia and Tyler Robinson and his actions. I think that's maybe unfair, but ultimately I think reasonable.
I think wildly unfair to say because one radical terrorist is a member of a political group commits an act of terrorism, the entire group can't hold any institutions of
And
power.
then the entire
That's actually
group-
the same argument that a lot of fascistic and authoritarian regimes have used
Well-
to take power from their opponents. And if we're using that, Republicans don't get to hold many positions of power because Republicans have committed political violence at a higher rate than Democrats every year for the last 30 years, except the year we just had. So we had 29 straight years of the exact opposite playing out.
First, I'd challenge that as factual. I don't necessarily know that that's true. And second, I'd say that, I do apologize, the first point was, okay. So pretty much what I am saying is that it is situationally dependent. You can't just say that Republicans reject pluralism in the contemporary sense just because, you know, essentially they don't understand it, or they're dumb, or they're not well read enough. Clearly, I do understand the concept of pluralism, and I do accept its importance in a Western civilization, in an Enlightenment situation, or a civilization built on the Enlightenment. But at the same time, I do, in the contemporary context, reject its importance on the basis that, and there's a number of other issues that we can get into where the left essentially demonstrates a lack of real sense regarding the realities of life that everyone is expected to live, at least. You know, I mean, we can get into, especially the concept of gender, and the number of people that we now see who do commit acts of violence at random or after a very short period of provocation, who also happen to be, whether it's transgender or in some manner, you know, and I'll just say, self-identifying as abnormal sexually. You know, there's just all these different things that play into say the Republican Party is ultimately, in my opinion, maybe actually purposefully justified in rejecting pluralism in the contemporary context. You know, when you have, let me put it to you this way. If you have an objective wrong and an objective right, and there are only a handful of people who believe in the objective right, a handful of people who believe in the objective wrong, or the objective right necessarily unjustified in saying we don't want to share power with those who are objectively wrong? That's what I'm asking.
I didn't think I'd be arguing fascism was bad. I thought I'd be arguing the Trump administration is fascist. But it is increasingly appearing like I'm going to have to argue fascism is bad. When he says rejecting pluralism, he means rejecting a non-autocratic state. That is what rejecting pluralism means.
Well, I mean,
you're using more friendly language to dress it up, right? And for the first thing you said, when you said you're unsure about the statistic I mentioned, that's from the FBI. Trump actually took that down shortly after Charlie Kirk's murder, though, because him and a lot of his friends lied, claimed the left does more political violence.
I mean,
But FBI data showed that. I encourage people to look it up, actually. Yes, for the last 30 years. You know what? I might walk it back. It might be 20. I might be misremembering, but it's at the very least 20.
The further question in that circumstance and with that example is, did the right then condemn those people? Did the right condemn someone like a Dylan Roof in this state? Yes, absolutely. Our Republican governor at the time decided to go through the state and remove all sorts of Confederate symbols, which in my opinion had very little to do with the circumstance, but regardless of that issue, you have all of these examples that you'll use where individuals on the right go and they do these terroristic and horrible things, and then the right condemns them. When Charlie Kirk was shot, the left overwhelmingly celebrated.
Name a single left-leaning politician or anyone with power, like political power on the left, anyone in office
That's
that celebrated.
not even necessarily disqualifying my claim. My claim was that individuals who identify themselves as Democrat, the Democratic Party on the whole, and the left, which I'm referring to very vaguely and politically, celebrated the death of Charlie Kirk. So it's not about who's in power. And then I can point to somebody like Jay Jones, who said he would willingly and happily kill the children of his opponent and his opponent for raising little fascists.
Yeah, and I agree that one was reprehensible.
And yet he got elected.
Yeah.
So then that reflects even more terribly upon the Democratic base, does it not?
I think that reflects most notably on how uneducated most American voters are, which I think is something both of us would agree on.
That's
When
certainly
the
an
average
issue,
person
but
casts a
then
vote,
that-
they know very little about the person they're voting for. They mostly do so based on party allegiance and like
I'm sorry,
propaganda.
I didn't know you were anti-democratic.
No, I'm very pro-democracy. I'm in the Churchill camp. Democracy is the worst thing the worst form of government we've tried, aside from all the other ones. So me bringing up a criticism of democracy, which is valid, doesn't quite equate to me being anti-democracy.
Sure.
But rein it back
Do we
into
live
the
in I'm
pluralism.
sorry, I'm not going to use that republicanism. Never mind. I was going to ask, do we live in a republic? Of course not. It's a
A
sorry,
representative
do we live
democracy.
in a democracy? There we go.
But yeah, reining it back to the pluralism point, right? It relies on multiple competing centers of power. Dude, this is the first time I'm using the notes. I didn't expect using this sparingly. So the Trump admin is guided by the exact antithesis to pluralism, unitary executive theory. Here's a quote from Trump's press secretary in early 2025. He is the executive of the executive branch, and therefore he has the power to fire anyone within the executive branch that he wishes. In reference to Trump mass firing inspector generals, the people within our government that catch waste, fraud, and abuse, what Doge claimed they were going to do and then failed to do. These same inspector generals return us well over $12 per dollar we spend on the program. But this is illegal, by the way, this idea of governance. And Humphrey Executive of the United States, they explicitly ruled that, the Supreme Court did. It refuses Caroline Leavitt's claim here, and that of the Trump administration. Because if we accept this as fact, then Congress has no power, which is what unitary executive theory, and unfortunately seemingly my opponent, want to do. If the president can fire anyone in the executive branch, if Congress makes any kind of organization, any group, the president can just mass fire everyone and effectively kill it. He can fully override Congress. That's not a democracy. That is autocratic. And I think autocracies are bad.
I think that that's largely a purposeful misrepresentation of the work that people like, actually our friend Paul Danza did in the Office of Personnel Management. So the Office of Personnel Management, and further than that, the federal government as a whole, was infested with people who had worked in federal government for 30, 40 plus years, who had made a career of basically not doing their jobs. You wonder why American governance has become less and less efficient, why something like the national debt has grown for the last 30, 40, 50 years. It's because you have these bureaucrats who just bury themselves into the bureaucracy and exclusively serve their own ends. And so what the Trump administration tried to do in its first go-around was basically attack the trenches that these people had dug for themselves, wash them out of them, fill them back in, and restore the intentional and purposeful, I would say, higher rate of turnover that you're supposed to see in the federal government, because otherwise you get these people who don't do their jobs, get paid anyway, and who get screwed? The American.
You know what happened, ironically enough, with Doge? They actually didn't save us any money, and that's from the Cato Institute, a center-right think tank, by the way. Doge didn't save us any money because they did exactly that. And lo and behold, what we found out was there was a lot of expertise we fired. There was a lot of people we needed, like air traffic controllers, for example. I don't know if y'all were following politics during that time period. Some airports actually had to close down temporarily because they couldn't land planes. Because a lot of people in our government serve roles that we actually need. And it's really convenient to paint it all as fraud and a scheme and everything, but there's a reason Trump fired the inspector generals, those who actually bring forth fraud. There's a reason Doge hasn't prosecuted a single person of fraud, because Doge was an excuse to go after parts of the government Trump didn't like. It wasn't about saving money. They didn't go after the Pentagon at first, the one that's never passed a single audit. They went after the Consumer Finance Protection Bureau, the organization that stops big banks from screwing over people like you and me. The organization that returns tens of billions of dollars to regular citizens and stops banks from doing horrible things. That's one of the first groups they went after. And then USAID, who was investigating Elon Musk for something he did with Starlink. I don't remember much of the specifics there, but USAID wasn't a huge waste of our money. 1% of our budget goes to foreign aid. 1%. And due to those USAID cuts, 600,000 children have died already. 400,000 children, 600,000 people. That's projected to be 10 million by 2030.
Sure.
We were saving those lives for pennies on the dollar, and we were getting so much soft power influence as a result of that, and they just killed it because they didn't like that. Doge was never about saving money. That's why they didn't save any of you money. Have any of you got your Doge rebate checks you were promised? I haven't. I would love it, but I didn't get it because it wasn't about saving money. It was about going after parts of the government Trump didn't like. It was about stealing the power of the purse from Congress.
Yeah, I totally disagree. Specifically, I'll cite that recently the CFPB was able to win a case against New Valiant, which is essentially a student loan company that had screwed over any number of Americans who were trying to get an education, just like we are. They recently were forced to return upwards of $100 million by the CFPB under the Trump administration. So if you want to cite somehow that the Consumer Finance Protection Bureau is being attacked by the Trump administration, and yet they're doing their job very effectively, I think that's a bad example. I think it's a bad argument. Further than that, trying to argue that air traffic controllers or, goodness, park rangers and all these other things, I'm going to cite the Washington Monument effect, which is when you remove funding from a particular part of the government, the people who are in charge of that particular part of the government, who make the most money in that particular part of the government, will oftentimes fire those under them, and thus screw the entire system under them, because they want to maintain their own control. Remember the bureaucrats I was talking about earlier? They want to maintain their entrenchment within the government because, well, they like living comfortable lives, doing a bad job, and benefiting from it anyway. That's what the Trump administration is attacking. That's what kind of the more libertarian...
Why did they ask to hire them back? Why did they have to pay extra to hire them back?
In certain cases, I'm sure that there were mistakes made, but at the end of the day, the larger effort made was not made for the purpose, as you are claiming, of attacking the parts of the government that Trump just doesn't like. That's just not what happened.
Then why didn't he go right hard after the military first? The Pentagon's never passed a single law.
Your claim is that he's going after parts of the military he doesn't like, and yet he should have gone after the military.
Because they've never passed an audit. All the other groups they went after passed an audit.
I know that. How are you, okay, my question at that point then becomes, how are you going to go after the military and expect me to capitulate on that point? Yeah, it's probably pretty hard to manage the finances of the single largest military in the world. You know,
Yeah.
should we cut back, should we cut back, and this is one of the biggest arguments that the Trump administration made, the first Trump campaign made. We need to cut spending on the military because we don't need to be involved in all of these foreign conflicts.
Except every budget he's proposed is increasing the military budget.
As it has become necessary, especially in the second administration, following the absolute failure of Biden to maintain any form of American hegemony internationally.
You
still
mean
have
like
to
destroying our
utilize-
soft power? Like
You still have to utilize that soft power that you're talking about, but that soft power clearly was ineffective.
Yeah.
Because after Trump comes into office, all these foreign wars, they dry up. We are actively attacking organizations like USAID, because they're ineffective at maintaining this concept of soft power that you keep talking about. I don't want American, further than that, if we have to use soft power by essentially, producing 10 million dependents upon the United States government over the course of the next 4 years, that's ridiculous. That's a ridiculous concept in my mind.
I'm a fan of giving vaccines to developing countries so children don't die. I
That's
think
totally
that's a
fair.
good thing.
That shouldn't be
That
done
also
by the
helps those
American
countries
government.
develop
It shouldn't be
faster
done.
so they're less dependent on us because they then have more people and they have more ability to build
Sound like a
infrastructure.
libertarian. I don't want to do that. Which is more effective at distributing, actually, further than that, which has more motive to distribute those vaccines effectively? Humanitarian groups in the United States that receive not only monitored but controlled funding, and then we can actually utilize those groups, send them internationally, and do these things that you say are so great, or should we just, and I'm actually reminded of a Senator John Kennedy clip here, where he's looking at this guy that's from a representative of USAID. It's during a Senate hearing, and he's asking him about it's about something ridiculous. It's about something like, I don't know, I'm going to be a little hyperbolic here, I'll have to pull the clip up later, but it's like, transgender pole dancing training in Slovakia or something like that. It's ridiculous stuff that we found in these USAID files. So
A lot of
look
which
at
was
these
not
files.
true, mind you. Or horrifically exaggerated. Like the framing was incredibly off on it. Although I think that's going to
Regardless-
require too much digging into
regardless.
sources for us to really solve here. I encourage you to look it up on your own.
Yeah, absolutely. Look into USAID. A lot of the money that was being spent by USAID was just not useful. It was a misallocation of funding, and that's why ultimately the Trump administration, and further than that, the entire right wing, condemned them once we were given access to their finances.
We're given access. We had access. they've
And yet,
been a government agency.
the Biden administration chose to accept all of these ridiculous things and actually promote all of these ridiculous things that we found in their reports. Why?
Yeah, and if it was just all these ridiculous things, so let's just hypothetically say, yeah, they were doing, they were paying for pole dance strip shows in fucking Sri Lanka for transgender people, right? Sure, man. Why not just cancel that? Why do you also have to cancel vaccines to children in developing countries? Food aid for in developing countries. Food aid. Why cancel that stuff?
Well,
Stuff that makes us look
so
much
that-
better. Here's what the soft power we mentioned.
So
here.
you're,
No,
you're,
becomes
I
irrelevant.
gotta cut you. You're trying to make the argument that just because Trump is cutting off
Can I overrule?
just because Trump is diminishing our soft power and kind of draw the parallel that makes the Trump administration fascistic.
No, right now we're on pluralism, and
Yeah.
I brought up
We're
Doge
good.
and how
This
Doge
is
is
how this is gonna go.
anti-pluralism because
That's why I
Doge
said I wanna make it
is stealing the power from us from Congress.
Yeah.
Although we have gotten quite a bit off. I would not mind being
Well,
thrown
further,
back.
okay, I'll challenge again in saying that necessarily, it's not just the executive which is going in and removing these various funding programs. It's also the Republican-controlled Congress and the Republican-controlled House. So we're not exclusively just isolating the power of the purse from the Congress. You know, is there going to be more interplay because there is an exclusively Republican government at the moment? Sure. But it's not like, and again, I mean, you cited unitary executive theory, it's not like he's Andrew Jackson. It's not like he's telling the judicial and the Congress to just, go screw themselves.
I have a quote. I have a beautiful quote.
Oh, good.
His
Good.
vice president said this before he chose him to be his vice president. This came from J.D. Vance. I think that what Trump should do, like if I was giving him one piece of advice, fire every single mid-level bureaucrat, every civil servant in the administrative state. Replace them with our people. That means loyalists.
Real.
And when the courts, because you will get taken to court, and when the courts try to stop you, stand before the country like Andrew Jackson did,
That's
the guy
right.
who just said he's not
That's
white,
right.
and say, the Chief Justice has made his ruling, now let him enforce it. What J.D. Vance was referencing there was Andrew Jackson sending the Native Americans on the Trail of Tears. That's what he was positively referencing. Him ignoring the Supreme Court, defying judicial constraints on power, and doing the Trail of Tears.
Real. Yeah, so I mean, at the end of the day, that's, in my opinion, in my personal opinion, this is not necessarily a statement representative of the Clemson College Republicans. That's really cool. Oh, man. I mean, at the end of the day, you do have this sense of urgency.
I rest my case, honestly. I don't even have to make my arguments.
Especially in the modern context, you have this sense of urgency among the right wing where if we allow for the modern left, which has, again, entrenched itself in the modern judicial system so deeply that we now see, I mean, how many times do you think the Biden administration technically broke the law and the judicial system pretty much overlooked it because they're all activist judges, right? And this actually, we'll try and move on if we can to another point out of 14, but you do have this leftist infrastructure that exists within the government, or at the very least, democratic infrastructure that exists within the government, as a result of the Obama era and as a result of the Biden administration.
Trump's appointed more judges than any Democratic president, by the way.
That's
Just so you
true.
know. So the whole
That's true.
activist judges thing.
We're fixing the problem.
And he also calls Republican-appointed judges activist judges.
Yeah, because
Many
a lot
judges
of times
appointed
they
by
are.
Bush, he's called activist judges.
Yeah, because-
A Bush-appointed judge actually just recently said ICE was in violation of 96 court orders right now.
And so I'll kind of address
And he said that was an activist judge.
if I can. The differentiation and ultimately the rivalry, sort of this almost sense of real vitriolic hatred that exists between the pre-Trump Republican Party and the post-Trump Republican Party, the present Republican Party, is, I would say, as intense, if not more so, than the rivalry that exists between the modern left and the modern right. The old right hates Trump. They really do. You talk to anyone representative of a camp like, that Lindsey Graham exists in, and they just can't stand the idea of the American people being legitimately represented by an executive who's willing to hold power, who's willing to actually stand up against all of these different systems that are protected by the various different legal documents, this just mountain of red tape that exists to prevent any reasonable or actual America First action from being taken. If you want to stand for the American people, you have to either dig through 60 years worth of red tape, get beaten in the next election and absolutely fail, like we've seen like we saw from Bush, who just, ultimately didn't even really try. But anyway, about it, you just have no incentive, as someone on the right at this point, to dig through that mountain of red tape instead of just saying, you know what, we do have power at the moment. this is the same way that you guys tried to wield power. We're going to do what's necessary to enact our political will, and if we have to get sued out of existence, if every single person in the administration gets, sued and then put in prison or literally, made to be an inmate for the rest of their lives, I think that's a sacrifice that the contemporary Trump administration is willing to make, because that's the kind of problem that the modern left has made for the American people.
See, I'm actually fast forwarding to another point. I was hoping to go linearly, but your response just perfectly summed it up. Point number 7, obsession with a plot.
Yep.
Right?
I was referencing that.
Yeah. Fascism is intellectually weak. It can't understand randomness, multiple causes, institutional friction, right? It smoothed all of this complexity over with some plot, the deep state, right? Which is, again, ironic because the closest thing we have to a deep state is the Epstein gang, which, Trump was really a fan of.
Oh, please.
I have a quote for here. I have another quote for you on that one later. But this also normalizes conspiratorial thinking. It helps with existential framing. If you notice, every authoritarian throughout history comes to power saying, I don't want to take all this power, but I have to because my opponents did this and they did that. And if I don't get all this power to combat them, then we can't. That's the same argument you just made.
Yes, it is.
You're saying, oh, the left has just done all this stuff. I don't ever recall the left saying, we're going to defy the Supreme Court. I think it was based when they did the Trail of Tears. I think the judicial system is wild. I think it's like they're all activist judges. Here's an obsession with a plot. Here's a list of institutions which are compromised, that are conspirators according to Trump. These are all institutions at one point or another he has labeled the deep state. The DOJ, the FBI, the judicial system, the CIA, the CDC, the NIH, the WHO, Federal Reserve, DHS, Inspector Generals, Supreme Court, polling organizations, multiple polling organizations, and most universities. So is every judge, every institution, all of these scientific institutions we have, all these academics, are they all part of this grand conspiracy? Or is the dude who has been convicted of fraud multiple times and caught in lies consistently lying?
It's a great way to frame the question. So, first of all, the answer is yes, actually. The vast majority of these organizations that are very clearly and very plainly, you can plainly observe that these organizations are operating in lockstep to prevent any form of, whether it's a populist right-winger or a nationalist right-winger to come into power, they are operating in lockstep with one another. So maybe there's not this traditional, and I'll actually, what's the comedian's name? The older bald guy who I actually really don't like. He said there's no need for a traditional or organized conspiracy when there are common interests, when common interests align. You have all of these various organizations, and yeah, I think there do exist, in fact, you mentioned pollsters that are polling organizations that are, partisan polling organizations? Never heard that. I think that that's pretty clear, and then you talk about all of these same, it's called CNN. So you have all of these different...
Fox News partisan and untrustworthy. It's any polling organization that disagrees with him.
Fair enough.
The moment an institution challenges him at all...
Would you say Fox News is honest?
Oh, certainly
I
not.
certainly
But in favor of him, they're dishonest. They're biased in favor of him, and he
prior to
has
his
criticized
election,
him whenever they step out of line.
when he was extremely unpopular, when he was polling at 1% in 2014, 2015, do you think that they were on his side, or do you think they were pushing up like Jeb or Marco, little Marco?
Yeah, definitely not on his side.
Right.
But they
So
are
then
now.
at that point, and then after the unitary executive takes power, now they're on his side. Now they've capitulated, and now they're on his team. Isn't that how that works? Don't you think that's how power is consolidated, right? Or do we have to...
Not rightfully, that's how authoritarians do it, yeah.
60 years worth of red tape, as we mentioned earlier. It's just, maybe I'm too progressive in the traditional sense, but I actually want the American government to work for the American people instead of working through this ridiculous bureaucracy that ultimately has buried the American people in trillions of dollars of debt. It's now actively,
Except Trump spends more deficit spending than
Absolutely
Democratic presidents. He spent more than Biden, including and excluding COVID funding.
Absolutely
So they're burying the American people in trillions in debt. So let's elect the guy who cuts taxes for the rich and puts us even deeper in debt.
In this situation, you do have to fight power to fight. Right?
Yeah, we should fight debt with more debt, right?
Yeah,
we can just be
debt
infinitely
with active governmental solutions. Government operates exclusively off of debt. If you're going to increase the rate at which government functions, you are going to increase the rate at which you accumulate debt. That's
I'm
just
just
how
going
it's
to tax more.
Great idea.
Can legal abrasion get out before
Yeah.
we
Sure. Slow the pace down. Fair enough.
we can walk back into this. We moved quite a bit. I think I've justified pluralism quite extensively. Skepticism. Skepticism is a really important one. Trump is incredibly anti-skeptic, unless it's an institution he wants to discredit because they dare challenge him, right? He demands unquestioning loyalty from all of his close political allies. Multiple political allies have said that. His former Secretary of Defense, Jim Mathis, DHS Secretary, John Kelly, Attorney General, Jeff Sessions, Secretary of Defense, Mark Esper, and Mike Pence, his vice president, whom his supporters chanted, hang, because he wouldn't certify an election he didn't have constitutional authority to certify. He turns on them at the drop of a hat if they're the slightest bit skeptic. When his supporters are skeptic of the Epstein stuff, he tweeted, yeah, by the way, this isn't going to include you. If you think the Epstein files are real and you think Epstein did bad stuff, he's talking about you here. Their new scam is what we will forever call the Jeffrey Epstein hoax, and my past supporters have bought into this bullshit hook, line, and sinker. Let these weaklings continue forward and do the Democrats' work. Don't even think about talking of our incredible and unprecedented success, because I don't want their support anymore.
Yeah, so that's taken out of context and misrepresented purposefully. What he said prior to is as important, if not more so. The Biden administration had 4 years to release the Epstein files. Why didn't they? And that's a rhetorical question.
Okay.
So Biden, I mean, if you'd like to, please.
Yeah, because Biden's a Zionist. I love dogging on Biden. I'm not a big Biden fan. Biden is the less of available evils, all right? He's like not a tenth as bad as Trump, but he sucks.
Okay, so
That's why he didn't release the Epstein
I'll make
files.
the same clarification between Biden and his administration that you have between Trump and his. Why did his administration and those within it not make any difference, or are they all just Zionists too?
Largely because they are beholden to capital interests. They are within the wing of the Democratic Party that is captured by corporate interests. They depend on corporate donors. They're not within the progressive wing of the Democratic Party, which consistently fights against corporate donors and refuses to accept their money. So they represent a kind of incrementalism, a gradual reform, which is better than Republicans, but still not fundamentally the change we need.
Fair answer, I suppose. Really, the further question is, why then did we see, of course, given this quote and given the sentiment contained therein, pushback from someone whom I'm sure you would all find reprehensible, and individuals like Nick Fuentes on the far right, or someone like a Jake Shields on the far right, or any of these far right figures that are, I mean, I can only imagine you think they're probably more fascist than Trump or his administration. Why do we then see the condemnation of these people if all people who fit into the claimed group of fascists are evil, right? I mean, if this and the Epstein files are very much real and all of those things, I think, and this is another clarification I want to make, I think what he was saying here is if you believe that he individually is implicated as like a pedophile or a rapist or a murderer or whatever else, as so many people are in the Epstein files, as they've now released 3.5 million files, yeah, they're heavily redacted, but at the same time, I mean, how much do you think you're going to be able to drag out of the federal government when we know that so many of them are implicated in this? I think that, what
You mean
you're
the
saying
government
here,
run by the guy you're defending right now?
the government run by a, how many times do I have to say that he is actively attacking, and he stated in 2016, he is an outsider, he wants to get into the government and attack the government because it's full of evil people.
And he's appointed the people heading the agencies that are doing this cover-up.
Yeah, well,
Both-
that
both
is
the
problem,
members in
and I think that,
Congress.
I think that a lot of those issues do come from what you alluded to, which is being beholden to interests that are not those of the American people. But we don't see the left, I mean, the left, I would say, is far more captured by those interests in my mind. And in fact, it actually actively, when it is given power, works towards the ends of those interests. Whereas at the very least, within the contemporary right, you have some form of conflict.
I'm really glad you brought that up, actually, because we all hate how money's in our elections now, right? That's like the big bad thing. Everyone agrees. Citizens United was an awful Supreme Court decision. From 2000 until now, we've increased billionaire spending in elections from 120 to 160 times what it was prior, depending on which analysis you go by. 3 Supreme Court cases did that, right? There wasn't any legislation change from Congress. It was Citizens United versus the FEC, Ted Cruz for Senate versus the FEC, and then I can't quite recall the name of the other one because I didn't expect we'd get on this one. But all 3 of those were pushed by people within or heavily aligned with the Republican Party. And in every single one of the Supreme Court cases, every Supreme Court judge appointed by a Republican sided with billionaires to loosen finance restrictions. Every single Supreme Court judge appointed by a Democrat sided against billionaires, against loosening finance restrictions.
And then,
so yeah, the capital interest. If Democrats are more beholden to them, why did Supreme Court judges appointed by Democrats unilaterally opposed them? And why did the Republicans unilaterally bring the cases forward and vote to push those news precedents through?
So it just so happens that in 2016, this guy named Donald J. Trump came along and decided that he wanted to try and change that. He basically said, I'm not beholden to all of these people's donors, you know? And he actually said in a 2016 debate, you know, I'm here in front of this audience, and this audience is almost exclusively made up of these people's donors, and he points to his opponents. He points to people like Jeb Bush, Marco Rubio, Ted Cruz, as you mentioned. Yeah. And then he becomes, essentially tries to push those people out of power. Is that necessarily possible in the contemporary context? It's going to cause conflict within the party, which is what we're seeing. Right? So you see the Republican Party in its contemporary context, which I'll completely differentiate between anything that occurred prior to 2016. That Republican Party and I have very little to do with one another. In fact, we are actively in conflict with one another. Okay, so that Republican Party, I don't care what that Republican Party did, because it has no reflection on the contemporary Republican Party in my mind. What I was saying that, especially since 2016, those moneyed interests that did have control over the Republican Party and used the Republican Party primarily, when they lost control of the Republican Party, where do they go? They don't just disappear, they go and they take over the Democratic Party. So since 2016, I think, and this is what I'm ultimately saying, is that since 2016 and since the Trump revolution, as we refer to it, those moneyed interests have taken control of the Democratic Party, and those moneyed interests are now expressing their will through the Democratic Party primarily.
I would encourage you all to go to opensecrets.org. It's a website where you can track the spending by corporate PACs on political candidates. You'll find everything he just said is a lie. Republicans don't take money at significantly lower rates than Democrats. In fact, the only political wing we find consistently refusing corporate money is the Squad, the really progressive left. It's the Bernie Sanders, the AOC. That is the only political wing in America we find consistently refusing billionaire and corporate donations.
Okay. That's a great point. Well done.
Thank you. So, I think I've established
There's not a whole lot
rejection.
else to say there, you know?
I think I've established rejection of Enlightenment ideas pretty. Oh, scientific inquiry. Wow. Oh no, we already gotten that one. There's just so much. It's difficult to keep track of it all. Now,
I mean, if you reject institutional capture, then I think largely a lot of what I have to say is just going to be constantly rejected by things like looking up this website, going to this website and saying, hey guys, you should just go read these various things that I can't necessarily cite in this argument, but instead I can just make reference to this website. What I'm saying is that the super PAC thing that we just talked
the
about.
what?
The PAC spending.
OpenSecrets.org is captured also,
Sure.
right?
No,
Okay.
not necessarily. That's not what I'm claiming. What I'm claiming is that, ultimately what we see here is an example of maybe, and this is actually an important question. Maybe it is, and I'm not necessarily asserting that it is, but in the event that it is, how would you know?
Okay, so.
If this website that you're citing, if this website that you're citing isn't necessarily captured by someone, then how would you know? You know, because what we see in the Epstein files, as I've read a handful of them, is in fact nefarious plots like that being carried out in order to direct the American people to information that will ultimately lead them away from the clear, and again, this is a clear opposition to the powers that be, the powers that have taken control over this country. You know, and that is, in my opinion, the Trump administration, or at least those who work in it. Maybe not Trump himself, although obviously Trump himself was kind of the gateway into that. But I think it's maybe a little granular, maybe a little ridiculous even, to claim that the party that now has so much conflict within itself regarding these various higher powers, these various moneyed interests, these various, and as you alluded to, foreign interests that are trying to basically influence that party. There's conflict within the Republican Party, but when you look at the Democratic Party, I mean, yeah, there's the Squad, yeah, there's these, you know, ultimately very, and again, I mean, I'll actually bring it back to sort of the American interest at play, and I think this does get a little bit away from the topic at hand. But when you look at someone like an AOC or any number of other members of the Squad, you're sort of brought to understand that these are people who do not represent American interests in the traditional sense nor in the contemporary sense, but instead interests of, I mean, the president of Somalia, who issued a full-scale endorsement of Ilhan Omar, basically saying that she represents the interests of Somalians in America rather than Americans. I think that's ridiculous, and I think it's anti-American. And so to cite those individuals as your example for why corporate interests are having a harder time somehow, you know, introducing themselves or otherwise infiltrating the Democratic Party is a terrible example.
when Viktor Orban endorsed the Republican Party, was he doing so because it benefited Hungary or because they share?
Yeah, it obviously benefited Hungary.
I think just because a leader somewhere endorses somebody else, like, she's from Somalia, unless I'm mistaken, right?
Yes,
It's difficult to
she is.
remember where everyone's from. I could absolutely understand a leader feeling pride that someone from that
Given the
country
circumstances, if I
is
may interject.
of like that prominent stature in the largest economy in the world. The idea that she is then beholden to interest because of that, I just don't, like, you have to bring
Well,
up
that's
evidence
exactly
of
what
her
we're
being
seeing.
beholden to those interests, not just pointing out that she's from the place, and the leader was like, yeah, she's from here, she would do good there.
No, what I'm saying is not, especially, you make a comparison between the Orban endorsement and the endorsement from the president of Somalia. The president of Somalia visited the United States and spoke to a group of Somalians who live in America, whether legally or illegally, that's questionable. He visited and he told them that she is a representative of their interests within our country, right? The differentiation between Orban saying, you know, as a representative of my own nation and my own people, I think that this leader's a good guy and I think he's doing a good job, has very little to do with the foreign leader of a country coming here and saying that this domestic representative is actually more invested in the interests of people from our country who come here and live in her district for the purpose of being exclusively and actually very purposefully represented uniquely by her because of her bias towards them. She is not a good representation of an American politician because she's exclusively beholden to one, and in this instance, it's a particular ethnic group, which I find particularly unacceptable given the state of the argument.
A lot of big claims with remarkably little evidence there. Do you care to substantiate any of that, aside from just saying, oh, that's her
Yeah, you look at
ethnicity,
her
so,
district in
you know, she
Minnesota,
gotta serve
and
them.
you happen to look into their finances, $9 billion a year in money, and you look at the state of these leering centers that we've been made aware of.
You're referring
Yeah,
to the Nick Shirley stuff.
what I am referring to is,
The one where investigative journalists went to many of those places directly after, and multiple parents of multiple children that went there attested that they were fine. And Nick Shirley went there, and a lot of those times it was proven during the hours they were closed. And it was pressed this by an interviewer.
why
Also,
did
I'm encouraging more research. Look up a Nick Shirley interview with a journalist. He can't defend any of his claims at all. It's laughable and it's embarrassing.
When did I bring up Nick Shirley? I'm not referring to Nick Shirley, I'm referring to the now public financial statements from the government of Minnesota, where they're allocating millions, if not, actually collaboratively, billions of dollars a year to these tiny industries that are ultimately entirely unworthy of such a huge volume of investment, and it's almost exclusively within these communities that are ethnically beholden to a population that is either foreign, right, first generation people who either legally or illegally immigrate into this country from Somalia, and then they take advantage of the welfare state, which shouldn't exist in the first place.
The Leering Center was a reference to Nick Shirley, because in Nick Shirley's
Okay.
videos, it went to
The Leering Center was
So
a
you-
reference
you
to the
did-
greater system through the lens that Nick Shirley provided, not necessarily that
Okay.
Nick Shirley himself is at all, in my opinion, a good source for information.
Yeah, well, there's the multiple billions of claim that's the place they've come from, because there's no official document finding those multiple billions of dollars in fraud, right? Because
Yeah,
the
they
judicial
made-
system hasn't played out
They
yet.
made,
There's
they made
investigations
public.
going on right now, and I'm watching them. I'd love to see how they go out, how they end up being.
Well, that's
There's
why I
been
said,
some
I mean,
fraud that's
ultimately-
been proven, and it's all bad, yeah. But I don't think that
And yet it
constitutes,
is-
I don't think that constitutes
it
the
doesn't,
congressional representative from that region being owned. We're
It
so
doesn't
off topic,
necessarily-
we're so
I
off
think
topic.
we are.
Okay.
That's another point.
Yep,
Fair.
all right, point number 4, disagreement is treason.
we have 30 minutes?
We'll speed run this.
Okay.
Disagreement is treason. We've actually heard some of the underlying ideology behind this expressed by you here today. The leader embodies the people. The people are unified, and disagreement with the leader equals disagreement with the people, which is treasonous, right? Now, the latter parts of that you haven't ventured into. The earlier parts you absolutely did. Now, dissent is seen as disloyal to the nation. Any dissent or disagreement with the leader's narrative is treated as a betrayal rather than a legitimate critique. So Trump's framed the media, tech companies, other political enemies as the enemy of the people. He's directly said, Democrats hate our country. In 2018, at his State of the Union speech, he said, can you believe it? They didn't even stand for our great country. They didn't stand, they didn't applaud, they didn't do anything. Somebody said treasonous. I mean, yeah, I guess why not? They were like death and un-American. We had a lot of people sitting that were so unhappy with what was going on. I don't know if they love our country. And during this speech that he's chastising Democrats for not applauding for, he spent a significant portion of it attacking those very same Democrats. At a speech that is normally supposed to be unifying, and celebrating the nation's accomplishments. So he got behind a podium and bullied Democrats, and then said because they didn't applaud him doing so, yeah, I mean, I guess why not? That's treason.
No, I would say that the actions of the Democratic Party over the last, any number of years, but especially since their vitriolic reaction to his election in 2016.
That's a separate
those
claim.
are-
Do you agree with this? Do you agree this is an example of what I'm claiming? That this is labeling dissent or disagreement as treason?
It is,
I want to give you a chance to
In
make
this-
that. I just want to conclude this first.
in this context, it is labeling individuals who are already treasonous in not only the minds of himself, but also the 70+ million Americans who voted for him, as essentially rejecting the concept of the nation they live in. Who is
Further,
it?
you argue
Who is it in
your
2020?
pluralism.
Who is it in 2020 that went out and chanted "Death to America" when they were rioting after the death of George Floyd? It wasn't the right. It was a bunch of leftists who in the contemporary context, since the issues that have arisen in Israel, are out in the streets shouting "Death to America." Who do they vote for? Who are they represented by? Are they represented by people like Ilhan Omar, which I'll make a reference to again?
There's a really frequent strategy among authoritarians and fascists of highlighting the weakest and most extreme examples of people within a movement, and then blasting those to the front of the media sphere for it, right? This is a form of the straw man fallacy. That's what you're relying on there, right? Because
Is it
like, talk to the average Democratic voter, they're not gonna be like, I hate America. I know, I'm all over the Democratic voters.
You talk to the average Democratic voter, who are they going to point to when they point to the Republican Party? They're going to point to the one guy who actually speaks for all of us. With you guys, with the left, we have to point to so many different people. Who am I supposed to look at? Am I supposed to look at the people who are in fact chanting "Death to America"? Are those people American in your mind, in my mind, in anyone's mind? Maybe by citizenship, but certainly not by will.
Again, this is akin to me saying that like the Republican Party is like Nick Fuentes and Quakers. It's come on.
It's
dude.
really
This
not,
is
because
dishonest
the
and you
Republican
know
Party
it.
has on
You're saying we can look at Trump and we can point to Trump because he represents us. Who can I look to on the left? We have multiple elected representatives.
We'll go ahead and name
We-
one.
we
Just
vote on
condemn
them.
Biden.
Okay, let's see. AOC, Bernie Sanders. Bernie Sanders is one of the most popular senators in the country,
So
by the way.
this will come back to a point that I'll make, which is essentially that if you're condemning us for trying to consolidate power, then you're playing the game wrong. If you don't want to win, that's okay. Please continue to argue on the basis of all these various, I would say, very well constructed. You've done a great job in writing down all these notes and writing yourself out all these statements that you can read off. But at the same time, you've done a terrible job of actually arguing for the Democratic Party, or for the advancement of it. I guess if you're trying to prove that the Trump administration is in itself contemporarily fascist, then you've, again, done a pretty poor job in my mind, because all you've done is give me these limited examples of where, maybe these individual, and obviously there's a limitation on time kind of brings about an issue with this, but at the same time, when you're arguing that any given democratically elected, first of all, and you did separate from Trump himself, but Trump himself got 77 million votes in 2024. So we're talking about 77 million Americans who at the very least support this guy. And then his administration, which is appointed by him, and thus, at least in the spirit of it, is an extension of the will of those 77 million Americans. I see that as totally anti-fascist, actually. It's very much democratic. So in what way, and I'm kind of trying to reframe the argument so we can maybe move to another point, but basically, the Trump administration is, if anything, a total refutation of fascism in the contemporary sense.
Okay, so for starters, you defended some aspects of fascism leading up to this, so not really a refutation.
Well, again,
Another one.
what did I say when we began the argument? I said I was going to do two things. One, I was going to disqualify the Trump administration necessarily meets some of these qualities. If they do meet them, I'll freely admit as much. And in the instances where they do meet as much, or just when I feel that they are good points, then I'm going to defend the points. I personally,
And so far,
and
you've
so many.
exhibited multiple arguments that.
And so again,
fascism
this is
built.
why the left is losing. This is why you guys are losing.
Check
You
the polls
hide
right
behind-
now. Trump's
you hide
favorability is
behind the
like
term
upper
like-
30s.
Can I finish my point?
Yeah.
So you hide behind a term like fascism, assuming that everyone will take it seriously, and assuming that everyone is actually going to be scared of it. Unfortunately, you desensitize the American people to a term like fascism, which, if an actual fascist were to take control of this country, do you really think that judicial reform, that judicial actions in Minnesota would be forcing the administration to pull out ICE? Because that wouldn't be happening if this was an actual fascist administration.
I don't know if you remember the claim I made at the start, which is that we are not currently
Logan, you're sitting on the
under
wrong
a
side.
fascist regime.
Sorry, go ahead.
That we are not currently under a fascist regime thanks to the strength of the U.S. judicial system. But ideologically, they are, and they intend to be, right?
What, then are you just ceding your claim? Is the Trump administration fascist?
I'm not
or
ceding my claim. I explicitly laid out my claim at the beginning. You're just finding it difficult to argue against now, so you're trying to
That's
move
not
my
true at all.
goalposts.
Well, you established your goalpost. You said that the Trump administration is fascist.
Is ideologically fascist, not yet in action, thanks to the strength of the U.S. judicial system, which they are waging war against.
So you give me a topic and then you reframe the topic at the time of, and
I think that's a very fair argument to make, and you didn't seem to have any issue with it at the start. You're only bringing up issue with it now.
well, my issue with it is first of all that it's obviously inaccurate, and second of all that it has largely nothing to do with.
Obviously inaccurate. Let's continue with the points
Sorry,
there.
there's a little scene going on. That's over.
That was a scene. Obviously inaccurate. We can continue with the points then. Point number 4,
Sure.
disagreement is treason. When Mark Kelly and 5 Democratic congressional representatives released a video saying military officials can and should refuse illegal orders, something that is explicitly said that they have an obligation to do, both in the Uniform Military Code of Justice and the rules for courts martial, right? Because Mark Kelly is in the military himself. When Democratic representatives said that, what really happened was Trump said they're guilty of treason and should be executed. The exact quote was, "Seditious behavior punishable by death." He retweeted a Truth Social user saying, "Hang them, George Washington would." This was them simply telling the military they can and should follow rules we have in place to prevent tyranny. This Trump explicitly labeled as treasonous. So do you think it's fair to say Trump fits point number 4?
Not necessarily, because in
Okay.
this context, and again, we bring up all these issues where ultimately these points just don't apply very well. But in this context, you have elected officials who are not at all involved in the military who are going out and saying, actually, you know what, I think that the military should actively, what? I mean, they had no basis on which they could claim that the orders that the military was receiving were illegal.
That's not relevant or not? Because they
It
weren't
is.
saying refuse this order, they were saying if you're given an illegal order, refuse it. Which again, is legal. They are legally obligated to do that actually. So it's more legal to tell them they shouldn't do that, which is what Trump did.
So, first I'd ask that you repeat the claim from Trump, or the quote from Trump.
Okay. Seditious behavior punishable by death.
Yeah,
And that was his
seditious
response to
behavior.
their video.
It's
And
seditious.
then-
Are you familiar with the Sedition Act? I mean,
Yeah,
I mean,
is
it
it
is
seditious
conduct-
telling military officials they should follow the rules the military has
I
in
think
place
it's
to prevent
seditious,
tyranny?
given the political context, to tell military officials that they should disobey the commander-in-chief.
Yeah, we keep doing this thing where I like explain fascism and I describe the thing they do that's fascist, and you're like, yeah, well, it's kind of good though. Like, sure, you can just say this
Oh, no.
applies to them, but you're in favor of it.
Well, I mean, it doesn't apply, in my opinion. Obviously, I don't think that Trump is necessarily saying, first of all, this is, again, one of a handful of points that really don't point to anything that is necessarily that harming, especially given the context. You have to look at the context. This
Yeah.
is something where, and yeah, the points that I'm making are essentially, you have to, first of all, reevaluate not only your use of the term fascist, but then the application and the eventual harm that it does to both sides of the political aisle. Your side of the political aisle has been harmed, I would say, as much, if not more so, than the right, by using a term that is so harsh as fascist to describe things like this particular instance. You see an exchange of ultimately, clearly non-impactful rhetoric, which, this situation went nowhere. These people obviously were not hung.
Oh, they weren't hung, but he did try to bring criminal charges against them. A jury shot it down because obviously that's insane. But he tried to bring criminal charges against them. So that is suppression of dissent, pretty extremely, I'd say.
I disagree. They were allowed to make their public claims. What would you call the obvious sham cases brought against the president when he was running again in 2024? What would you call the convictions that he faced from a clearly biased, not only judiciary system, but then the same judiciary that has since then made very clear partisan opposition, or made a very clear partisan stand against him, since they convicted him of the 33 felonies that were obviously a total, farce. He's going to use the judiciary system in the same way that the left has.
Obviously a farce, even though he admitted to stealing the documents that some of those felonies were referencing. He then claimed they were declassified when they weren't, right? Like, there was that one. Then the falsified business records, I believe that was another one of the felonies. It's hard keeping track because there's so many felonies. The falsified business records, they are now publicly released. We have evidence for those things. It's not lawfare, right? The court
Well, it
system.
absolutely was lawfare at the time. And it not only is then, but it is now.
Yeah, even if we have evidence, it's lawfare to go after our supreme leader. But we're not fascists.
Funny.
The idea that like, oh, we're using fascism too flippantly, where
You really
the
are.
left is being silly about it. Okay,
Well,
let's
I
go
mean,
to Jason Stanley,
let
the
me
author
give
of
you
how
an example.
fascism works.
If I can very quickly
Okay,
give you
go
an
for it.
example. On this campus alone, and I'm sure for many of you,
Yeah.
after we were tabling following the death of a political commentator, Charlie Kirk, I had any number of people come up to me and say that Charlie Kirk was a fascist. And I'm not going to necessarily ask you to defend that action, because I think it's indefensible largely. But that's an example of the many different ways in which the left uses the term fascist far too, not only flippantly, it's not flippantly, it's just in an embarrassing lack of understanding of either the term, which is in itself so nebulous that you have to provide 14 points and then have essentially an hour and a half long debate as to what it even is. And then second,
Fascism hates nuance also. But anyways,
oh,
continue.
please. I mean, fascism, if you exclusively rely upon nuance, then how are you going to resist something like fascism? This is my personal challenge to the Democratic Party. If you believe that you are rejecting or otherwise opposing something that is necessarily and inherently wrong, then please oppose it more effectively. Debates like this just don't really work, do they?
We're saying the same shit.
Really?
That's my main, my
Because
main
at the end
argument
of the
with
day,
Democrats.
you just aren't doing a very good job. If you genuinely believe this guy is fascist, then, I don't know, stop calling people like Charlie Kirk a fascist. Stop calling people like Ben Shapiro fascist, for goodness sake. What are we doing? Actually, not what are we doing, what are you guys doing?
So, I think that would be a valid response if you didn't bring up the whole thing about, misusing fascism prior to essentially argue that I'm using it too flippantly here. You can bring up examples of other people using it in a way you would define as too loosely. That you're talking to me though, right?
Well,
And
so the point, that was a largely, not only unrelated point, but a point that does have some reflection upon this conversation. My expectation coming into this debate, and I think ultimately the expectation of the majority on this side of the room, was that we were going to hear points that had very little to do with the contemporary, and I'll make perfectly clear. I made a lot of biased judgments based on any number of factors. But the primary point, and ultimately the point that still stands, is that the term fascist just doesn't really mean anything in the American context anymore because of how flippantly and how regularly it's been used by the left. Right? So instead of calling Trump a fascist, try calling Trump like an authoritarian. Try calling Trump any number of other things where then we can have a debate like this where it'll be a little more academic and I'll be, I don't know, you've got an iPad and you're reading a bunch of pre-prepared statements and I'm over here just trying to basically make do. That's where the state of the...
You were also told you could bring notes.
I understand that. Believe me, I understand that. And that's why I say kind of the nature and the state of the rhetoric at this point, the nature of the conversation has devolved to such a degree that, if the right is captured by a fascist leader, then you need to effectively convince them as such. And you can't really call the kettle black and expect those who like the kettle to react in a positive manner or to necessarily engage with you, right? There are any number of those that I'm associated with, even on the right, who would condemn me for having this conversation, which I think is bad. But then there are any number of those on the left who do the same thing and have done the same thing for longer, right? There's only a very recent example that I can give you of that kind of, I would say, resistance to conversation or resistance to debate from the right. The left has been condemning people for having conversations and canceling people for far longer.
I'd love to get into that, but we're veering off topic.
Not necessarily, in my opinion.
I definitely think we are, but we're defining fascism right now, and it's
Sure.
fair to talk about the Trump administration in that context, right? How the left behaved isn't terribly relevant to that, and how regular people on the left, a bunch of foot soldiers, behaved a decade ago isn't terribly relevant either,
Oh, a decade.
right? Is it? You were saying back then especially. But anyways, so whether it's, unjustified to call the Trump administration fascist, right? Jason Stanley, the author of How Fascism Works, one of the world's most respected academics on fascism and authoritarianism,
Never heard of them.
I'm not surprised, left America and went to Canada, and when asked why, he said he didn't want to raise his kids in a country that is rapidly tilting towards a fascist dictatorship.
There's a giant part of Canada that's trying to split away from Canada.
That doesn't have any bearing on the claim
It
I just
really
made.
does. I think I'm basically just casting aspersions on Canadians, and especially people who prefer Canada United States. Please.
It has no bearing on his like educational background
Well, clearly
for
it does.
defining fascism. Historian Robert Paxson, another one of the most widely cited scholars on fascism, has also said that it's pretty fair to label Trump fascist, especially after January 6th. Before that, he was really hesitant. After January 6th, he was.
Sure.
Right?
So again, I'll actually lay back onto the same point that I made at the beginning, which is you're going to have to convince me that calling things fascist is actually either effective or necessarily a bad thing.
Yeah.
Right? And this actually gets into the philosophy of this. Why is, other than because it's illegal in some manner, why is the concept of the unitary executive necessarily inferior to the concept of, I don't know, the alternative, which is the rule of the Congress, which is probably the single most corrupt organization, the single most corrupt individual body of individuals on the planet? Would you rather be beholden to how many people? I mean, it's nearly 600 people in the elected body, or one guy that you can point out and say, he's doing a bad job, let's get rid of him every 4 years?
The issue is when you give one guy more and more and more power, it gets harder and harder and harder to get rid of him every 4 years.
Well, I mean, that's
right?
the thing is, you look at the history of basically rule by a singular man, and then you get, I don't know, monarchy that existed for 1,500 years. And
Yeah, went pretty horribly.
I disagree.
I don't even have to
really
make
do,
the
I really
argument.
do.
I just have
I
to
mean,
gesture
again,
when he
this
believes.
This is the level of instability that I think that the contemporary American just rhetoric has gotten to. And further than that, the level of instability that the American nation has gotten to. Yeah, you're going to get people who genuinely do investigate whether or not democracy, which is, again, a terrible system by all accounts, especially in the minds of the ancient thinkers, you get a system like democracy that is defended to the hilt by those who, I mean, either don't participate in it, or make arguments that are totally ineffective against those who are supposedly attacking it.
You remember when you disparaged a bunch of your political opponents earlier as like, anti-American, and here you are arguing against the founding ideas of America?
The reason
This is
that I
actually another trait within fascism. They get to decide what an American is, and if they get to define it very narrowly, and if you're
Correct.
outside of that, you're the outgroup, and you're
Correct.
bad.
Correct. Because the American founding, if you remember, if you've ever read something like the, I don't know, I'll cite the Naturalization Act of 1790, I believe, the founding fathers pretty much intended this to be a white country, a European-descended country. So if you're going to call me anti-American for challenging that the party of people who want to, represent the interests of Somalians who are defrauding our country, if you're going to call me anti-American for opposing that party, then yeah, I think we're going to have to basically walk down the last 300 years of 250 years of American history and investigate whether or not the framers, who were, in my opinion, the most American people who have ever lived, the only, in a large context, the only American people who have ever lived, maybe their contemporaries. But we're going to have to walk down 250 years of political philosophy, just basically political arguments that would take way too long. So in the contemporary context, you can call Trump a fascist all you want, but at the end of the day, he's nothing like a Benito Mussolini. He's nothing like an Adolf Hitler. He's nothing like any of these various, I would say obviously problematic figures who caused so much damage in their time.
He's remarkably like them in their early stages, right? And a lot of it is logic that you have used and defended, right? The idea that, we need one guy, one big strong man to represent, and we need to get rid of the checks and balances on that. Any institution that challenges it is corrupt and they're all bad, right? Like this is the logic every fascist has used to erode democracies. And this is the logic every authoritarian has as well. Earlier you asked, why don't we just talk about authoritarianism? I'd love to, and we've been doing that this whole time. I've been making plenty of arguments that prove Trump is authoritarian. I'm just saying the bar fascist also, because I think that's another thing that is equally as bad, no, definitely worse, and very well, easy to substantiate.
Definitely worse. So like
Yeah.
a left-wing authoritarian would be better than a right-wing authoritarian? Or less damaging in some manner?
I think it super depends on the way they execute their authoritarianism, but I also think that's a bit of a very small topic.
Fair. Okay.
So for point number 5, fear of difference. Fascism channels social frustrations, fear, and personal humiliation into hostility, right? It is characterized by a hostility towards outsiders. We see this in Trump and the modern Republican Party, in our isolationism, in our treatment of our allies, threatening to annex their territories, right? Tearing up all of our trade agreements with them, lying about the deal, the stipulations of those trade agreements, like the reciprocal tariffs, which were just false numbers, by the way. Again, Center-Right Institute, Cato. Fear is elevated as a central organizing myth of fascist movements. We see this, and again, combined with hostility towards outsiders, with their talk about migrants, their xenophobia, their homophobia, right? All all the phobias are an expression of this. They're downstream of fear.
There's nothing I like more than being called xenophobic or homophobic or all these other things, because ultimately at this
I don't know
point,
you well enough to know
in the-
why, but Trump, yeah, for
oh,
sure.
please. I mean, I'll just tell you, as the Democratic Party and its base define those terms, absolutely they apply. Because if you stand for pretty much anything that opposes the contemporary, leftist view of the ideal society or the idyllic expression of American society, then you're called those things, and that's just how it goes. So yeah, I mean, if you want to paint the Trump administration as in some manner, what's the exact wording used in the point? Resistant to
For how it works, let's see, resistant to what?
the point itself, the fifth point from Umberto. if you'll-
It's fear of difference.
Right, so the difference between, my goodness, how are we going to qualify fear of difference from any number of just non-functioning social institutions that you allow into your society? If you allow, and this is something that Hillary Clinton just condemned. Mass immigration at an uncontrolled rate, as we have seen over the last 5 years, well, under the Biden administration, destroys the nation. It absolutely undermines the societal fabric of the country. And so, I mean, we had 10 million people into this country illegally, and my goodness, we're not going to be able to get even a quarter of those out, not even a tenth of those out, at current rates, especially when we have an entire half of the population resisting the efforts of law enforcement as they try and remove those illegal immigrants. I mean, if I have to pick sides between someone who's supposedly fascist and someone who does not believe in the rule of law at all and wants to actively undermine the very existence of the American nation, well, myself and 77 million other Americans are going to pick the guy who's supposedly fascist.
I have bad news. Undermining the rule of law applies significantly more to fascists than the Democratic Party
Let's
right
just
now.
analyze the impact of that claim. 10 million people from random countries all over the world who may or may not be here to build a better lives for themselves or to parasitize the economy, to ruin especially the labor markets, right? I mean, you have these 10 million people and their various advocates within the government who are allowing them to come here without any check, any operation of law. So that's a solid percentage of the population now that is totally, actually not even necessarily subject to the law, because you try and bring a legal suit against someone who has no legal representation in the United States, what are they going to do? They're just going to send them back to wherever they came from. That's ultimately, at that point, that is the extent of American law, is deportation. So 10 million people who are essentially above the law or outside of it, present illegally, or what?
Taking some really big leaps here.
We're really not. That's
Above or
that's a
outside of
pretty
the law,
reasonable
except
plan.
they're more legally vulnerable than like me or you. They have far fewer legal protections.
Well, not that they ought to have.
Above or outside of the law is a pretty,
Not
pretty
that they have,
calculated
not that they ought to
characteristic.
have equal protection. They're not Americans.
Yeah.
So why are they here?
Well, they came here for a better life, like you said earlier.
Okay, either do it the right way or get out. It's that simple.
And that's, I super duper wish. I
And
super
further
wish they did.
And
That's
this was,
great.
this was
But-
Hillary's point. This was Obama's point recently in Munich, was when you allow for 10 million people to come here and pursue a better life, at whose expense are they going to do that?
This is another point of fascism.
Yes,
it's
it
a
is.
zero-sum game.
Defend it
The
anyway.
outsiders are rising at your expense.
Defend it anyway.
Right? Yeah, I'm not going to defend it. You are.
Well, that's what I'm saying.
But
Defend,
I can
defend
answer,
that
yeah.
somehow their pursuit
They're
of
not
a better
rising at our
life.
expense.
Again, I'm
Right.
asking you, when they come here and they pursue a better life, does the American economy just become, I don't know, a money printing machine all of a sudden? Do they get to come here and have a better life at no one's expense?
I'm really happy you brought that up. So, they're dragging us down, right? They're harming us. They have lower
They're
rates of
actively-
criminality, right? We know that from the Cato Institute, from the American Immigration Council, from Brennan Center, from some academic studies. Texas started getting really, really good data on this because Texas tracks arrests by citizenship status. We know they commit less crimes than native-born citizens, right? And crimes are, pretty harmful economically. We know they work pretty frequently. We know they pay into a lot of welfare programs they can't withdraw from because they're not citizens. The Social Security Administration has multiple times talked about how the program would be near solvent by now if not for money immigrants paid into it, undocumented immigrants, because they can't withdraw from it. In fact, it was, let's see, there's too many points.
I didn't realize you had five. So,
Do we want to make just closing
Final
statements or?
closing thoughts, anything you want to get in?
Okay, we can look at that.
Well, you went first, so you go first.
Okay. So what you've seen here has been me, essentially, I think the first part was the most telling, arguing that pluralism, the idea that we should have checks and balances and separation of power, Everything that is resistant to authoritarianism and autocracy, my opponent defended. And he did so using the logic fascists use, that every institution that challenges our supreme leader is corrupt. Every single one of them. I listed like 10, 12 earlier, right? And there's multiple terms they use to do this. Rhino, right? TDS, stuff like that. That's another point, newspeak. Creating new language to flatten and erode nuance and cast any outsiders as uncredible, right? He's consistently used the logic of fascists to justify this administration grabbing more and more and more power, while simultaneously arguing that this movement is different than every other historical movement which has used the exact same pattern.
You done?
Yeah.
So, the American people identified their enemy. The American people identified that the neoconservatives within the Republican Party simply were not on their side. They were not representative of their interests. They identified that the Democratic Party was pretty much operating in very much a similar manner, and that they were importing millions of people from the third world, millions of people from outside our country who came here, they deflated wages, whether you believe that or not. They are criminal in their very presence if they're illegal, so I don't necessarily care if they commit crimes at a lower rate, supposedly. And then third, they elected a guy who wanted to work for them. They elected a guy who told them that he would work for them. And then they took his side repeatedly. I don't call that fascism, I call that the necessary and ultimately the rightful functioning of American governance. I call it the rightful functioning of the American democratic system, the American republic. And third, I support it to the hilt. So if you're going to call me a fascist for that, go right ahead. It'll be water off a duck. If you want to call me a homophobe or a racist or whatever else, by your definitions, you're probably right, because ultimately your definitions are in a lot of time just flat out wrong. So, yeah, there you go. That's all I got.
We appreciate you guys coming out, and one round of applause for our debaters.
Yeah, you were very much prepared.
We didn't even know how, like, a fifth of
How many paragraphs did you actually? That's pretty.
Dude, I have 20 pages.
Yeah.
There's a lot of
It's like, I didn't even know.
I don't know. I think I helped my
We only got to go through like 3.
Yeah, I think I held my ground pretty well.
We only got to go through. There's a lot of